Well, I believe that we can start our meeting. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to several of you that are participating in the afternoon from Europe, I believe some. Welcome to this informal meeting with the Council meeting with the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International. I wish to welcome the chairwoman of the federation, Mrs. Pilar Vera, and the Secretary General, Juniad Hamid. I believe that this is the first meeting of the Council with this federation. I know that the president of the federation has been attending a council meeting in 2013 in occasion of the approval by the council of the DOC 9998. Let me start saying, reminding that the council pays respect and sympathy to this organization. This organization is not a stakeholder as many others that meet the council, and this meeting has been promoted by me in the framework of the process that we have announced and launched to enhance the communication with stakeholders and other critical subjects in the system in order to enhance communication and facilitate mutual understanding, but also facilitate our decision-making process. In this sense, we know that I had some exchanges with the president of federation regarding a status of implementation of decisions or requests of the association of the federation that are still pending. And in this sense, I felt that it was absolutely helpful to have this informal meeting. Informal meeting means that we will have the opportunity to share information and to share views. It's not a decision-making meeting in the sense that the follow-up of this meeting will be brought by me to council in order to submit proposals for decisions. The meeting will be organized as follows. I will give the floor to the Secretary General for a brief introduction. Then I will give the floor to the President and the Secretary General of the Association of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation Association for the presentation. And then we'll have a presentation of the Secretariat on the status of implementation of a certain number of activities. And then we'll have the discussion with the Council. Maximum time dedicated will be 3 hours. Maybe that we will we dedicate a little bit less. Just let me stress one point. For me, it's important that we have this meeting with the Federation of Associations. We know that there are many associations. Sometimes I had some conversations or some meetings with them representing individual, unfortunately, sad events. What we wish to discuss here today is not a specific event, but is to discuss the general expectations of the overall group of associations that are incorporated in this federation, and to have a single voice of interaction between the Council and the federation. And with this, and now, as I said, I will give the floor first to the Secretary General of ICAO, and then I will pass the floor to the President or Chairwoman of the Federation. Madam Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everyone. I would like to join.
Madam, I believe you are mute?
No?
Or audio is not working?
No, we can hear her, Mr. President.
Okay, it's me.
Okay, okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. I would like to join Mr. President to welcome Ms. Pilar Vera, chairperson of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International, and Mr. Juniad Hamid, Secretary General of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International, to this informal meeting to the ICAO Council. I wish to express my sympathy for persons who have suffered distress and loss as a result of an aircraft accident. ICAO's policy in this area is to ensure respect for victims of civil aviation accidents and the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of their families. And the Secretariat works to ensure that these needs are considered and accommodated by all our member states. Since ICAO was created under the Convention on International Civil Aviation, or ICAO Convention, in 1944, its main objective has been to develop and amend international civil aviation standards and recommended practices, or SAPs, in order to harmonize the safe, secure, efficient, and sustainable development of the international air transport network. ICAO has established a global regulatory framework that comprises Assembly resolutions, international civil aviation SAPs contained in 19 annexes to the ICAO Convention, and associated guidance material that all ICAO member states must comply with or exceed through their civil aviation laws. These ICAO provisions govern all areas of air transport, including not only our core work in support of improved safety performance, but also accident investigation and facilitation and many other priorities. An aircraft accident is an unexpected and usually catastrophic event. Concern for persons who have suffered distress and loss as the result of aircraft accidents has led to increased efforts within the aviation industry to establish means by which the needs of victims and their families can be addressed in a timely fashion. During its 32nd session in October 1998, the ICAO Assembly considered for the first time the subject of assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families. Because of variations in the size and circumstances of accidents, the resources required to provide the family assistance will vary considerably. Therefore, proper planning is essential to ensure that assistance is adequate and sufficient. ICAO is attuned to the needs of the families and the victims of aircraft accidents and stands ready to continue working with the aviation community and the family associations towards the progress of this subject of utmost importance. Safety being one of the highest priorities of ICAO, our 193 member states are committed to reach their agreed global safety target of 0 fatalities by 2030, in tandem with the strengthening of their regulatory capacities, while pursuing a range of programs and targets relevant to current core areas of global aviation safety planning, oversight, and risk mitigation. As a result of this work on continuously enhancing safety, I'm proud to note that the probability of an aircraft accident can be significantly reduced by the effective implementation of ICAO SAPs and associated guidance materials. At the same time, we recognize that when such accident occurs, it can be potentially catastrophic, and we acknowledge that international air transport must continue to increase efforts across the community to establish procedures which address the needs of victims and their families in a timely manner. ICAO is committed to collaborating with its 90 193 member states, relevant international organizations, industry partners, and industry associations in the interest of the safety and the security of international civil aviation, including addressing the issue of assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families in a timely manner. A key objective today is to provide you with a brief overview of ICAO's regulatory framework and related activities on assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families, which will be presented by our directors and senior officers from concerned bureaus within ICAO, that is Air Navigation Bureau and Air Transport Bureau. I would like to take this opportunity to also recognize the contributions of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International in the development of the ICAO policy on assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families, Doc 9998, and the Manual on Assistance to Aircraft Accident Victims and their families, Doc 9973, and wish to express my appreciation and thanks. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. And while I'm going to give the floor to the chairwoman of the Federation International, Madam Pilar Vera Palmes, I wish to underline that we will have interpretation for this informal meeting. This is not a normal practice for informal meetings. For those that are not used with this platform, please stay on the channel of the language that we will be using. So under the key button of interpretation, select the channel that we'll be using and stay there, otherwise we can have some technical glitches. Madam Pilar Vera Palmes, the floor is yours.
Unfortunately, the interpreters do not hear the speaker.
Yeah, Madam, unfortunately, we cannot hear you. Can you check? We cannot hear you. No. Okay. Okay.
Yes, we can hear now.
Ahora sí.
Good afternoon from Madrid. Good morning, Montreal. And good evening to Karachi. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Shakitano, for taking the initiative of organizing this meeting. And my thanks also go to each member of the council for their assistance. We trust that proposals will be made in the future for everyone's benefit. I'd like to introduce the members of the Federation who are attending this meeting. They're representatives of associations in a number of countries. Bernd Gans of the German Association of the Accident of Flight AF 447, Air France, which crashed into the North Atlantic on July 1st, 2009, taking 228 lives. Koro Duschenas, president of the Association of Flight PS 752, which was shot down by Iran in January 2020, killing 176. Sandra Asali, president of the Brazilian Association that was created following the TAM 402 accident of October 31st, 1996 in Sao Paulo, claiming 99 victims, and who also represents victims of subsequent air accidents that occurred in Brazil. Nadia Mileron, the mother of a victim of the accident of flight ET Ethiopian Air 302, which occurred in Ethiopia on March 10, 2019, claiming 157 lives. Henar Guerrero Huran, Secretary General of the Association of Victims of the accident flight JK5022 on August 20th, 2008 in Madrid, killing 154 and seriously injuring 18. Monica Magaferi, a member of the Federation representing Comitato and Fondazione Ottobre d'Italia. They are attending the meeting, but as per our agreement, only myself and the Secretary General will be speaking on behalf of the Federation. Our Federation was created in the wake of two accidents. Flight KAL 007, which was flying from New York to Seoul. This accident occurred on September 1st, 1983. It strayed into Soviet territory and was shot down by a military aircraft, killing 269. Flight JK 5022 of Spanair of August 20th, 2008 occurred at Barajas Airport in Madrid. It crashed on takeoff, killing 154 and seriously injuring 18 survivors. The commitment of the two of us who lead both the associations has been decisive. I met Hans Ephraimson at the ICAO High-Level Safety Conference in 2010. And then both of us attended the International Conference of Victims and Families of Air Accidents organized by the NTSB of the United States in 2011. Both Hans and I were initially working without any kind of official support to update ICAO Circular 285, which was published by the Secretary General in 2001. We were able to gain the support of the president of the NTSB, Ms. Hersman, and also of ICAO to approve the update. The ICAO Council created a task force chaired by the representative of Spain, Mr. Victor Manuel Aguado, and made up of 37 countries, international organizations, and also victims representatives, Mr. Ephraimson and myself. In record time, document 9998, ICAO policy on assistance to victims of air accidents and their families was approved. On March 1st, 2013, the ICAO Council President, Mr. Roberto Kobe, invited me to attend as the sole representative of victims the council session where they unanimously approved document 9998, which was subsequently ratified by the 30th Assembly in September of that same year. Hans passed away at the age of 93 in 2013. And at the 30th Assembly, I was able to keep my promise to continue the work that we had begun together, and which I will never stop doing, assistance to victims. This commitment is something that I continue to work toward every day, and I hope that one day somebody will take over for me as I did for Hans. We would like for the document to be anchored in annex provisions, and we would like to include an Annex 9 facilitation, these provisions, so that it is well known by member states. The Council adopted recommended practice 8.46 with the aim of making this an international standard, hopefully. The Federation is made up of associations from Spain, Germany, Pakistan, Brazil, the Netherlands, Canada, and we also reach out to victims and friends from almost all of the accidents that have occurred in the last 15 years around the world. Ethiopian Air 302, MH370, MH17, Lion Air, Swift Air, PIA Pakistan, etc. We have suffered air disasters and have stood together in spite of the lack of resources, organizational chaos, harassment by the media, final reports that are not always credible or independent, insurers who don't respect their policies, and repeated systemic failures. For this reason, Juniad, Bernd, and I founded the Federation in Madrid in 2015 in accordance with Spanish law. Members of the Council, the victims' associations are like soap bubbles. They often are created after a tragedy, but they disappear once the final report is published and the judicial trial is over. Society and governments ask us to turn the page and forget. And for this reason, it's very important for everyone to understand that what we're doing in our federation, we want to continue our work and prevent the same mistakes from happening again. And our only resources are our will, knowledge, and commitment. The Federation seeks to speak with solidarity and single voice for air accident victims around the world under a common umbrella in international organizations. Our vision is victims helping victims. And this sums up our main objective of sharing experience, knowledge, sharing the pain, because we have experienced the same tragedy, and without resentment, so that we can faithfully cooperate with individuals and managers who are able to help and legislate and bring change. We want to share our experience of suffering with families of other passengers who have been in accidents. We have come a long way in our countries to obtain truth, justice, reparation, and memory. Our objectives are to promote shared practices, to deal with air crashes, improve and standardize assistance to victims following air crashes and assistance to families, protect passenger rights, promote prevention and accident investigation by independent authorities which confer credibility on official reports, provide a more human approach to procedures for improving air safety. On behalf of the Spanish Association of Flight JK5022, which I chair, and which was the genesis of our federation, I have actively participated in the creation and revision of Document 9998, a policy on assistance to victims and their families, and Document 9973. And we've also been involved in legislation in Spain and Europe. In the EU, we have Regulation 996/2010. In Spain, there's the Royal Decree 632, which covers the Victims Assistance Plan. There is a law on victims' status in Spain, and it provides that lawyers and prosecutors cannot file suit within 45 days of an accident. There's also a royal decree on planning for civil protection in response to civil aviation accidents. There have also been amendments to other laws which address various problems experienced by air crash victims, such as death of Spanish nationals abroad, identification of bodies, etc. And in Italy, there's a circular which gives advice to ENAC Gen 05, which came out in 2014. And it was at the initiative of Paolo Pettinaroli, who passed away in April 2015. And he was president of the Comitato Fondazione 8 Ottobre. And they are marking their 20-year anniversary this year. The summary of the ICAO Safety Report of 2020 indicates that annual statistics on accidents show an increase both in the overall number of accidents and in the global rate in 2019. We can say that aviation is safer, but if the current accident to flights ratio is maintained and the number of flights increases, then we can expect more air accidents and so more victims. The Federation believes that it is essential to establish a culture of air crash prevention and take a more humane approach while there's still time. So what has the Federation done with ICAO? At the 39th and 40th Assemblies, we presented 8 working papers on assistance to victims, accident investigation, independence of authorities, etc., and the papers were approved, but the recommendations have still not been implemented. Working paper 270 intends that recommended practice 8.46 of Annex 9 becomes an international standard. In 2018, the facilitation panel at its 10th meeting found that the majority of member states were not in compliance and did not report on compliance with the recommended practice 8.46. And we can presume that most are not aware of this requirement. And I'm going to ask that our Secretary General take the floor, Mr. Juniad Hamid, who will be presenting the 3 working papers, and then I will come back. If I may, Mr. President?
Sure. So, Secretary General.
Good morning, Mr. President and Madam Secretary General. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the papers here. We are very grateful, Mr. President, that ICAO has given us the opportunity here. Let me give you a brief description. My name is Juniad Hamid, and I'm an effectee of Air Blue flight ED202 that crashed in the hills of Islamabad, Pakistan in July 2010. I lost my dear wife of 9 years, 10 months, and 1 day on that fateful day. Following that crash, Mr. President, the Air Blue Crash Affectees Association, ACAA, was formed, which for the first time in Pakistan fought for families' rights and created history by raising this issue of families' assistance in Parliament, and were instrumental in having the rectification of resolution of 1999 Montreal Convention. Following that, a Carriage by Air Act was enacted in Pakistan, which was converted into a law in 2012. This Carriage by Air Act eventually is now the governing document for all the air crashes whenever they happen in the Pakistani skies. In the past 11 years, there have been 5 major air crashes in Pakistan, and our association has helped and guided all other affected families from personal help to guiding in obtaining legal help or professional, any psychological and professional help. It is unfortunate that despite having so many air crashes and multiple near misses, there still remains a long way in recognizing, accepting, and honoring the Families Association by Pakistani Aviation Ministry and Civil Aviation Authority. Pakistan was also a founding member in creating the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International, along with Spain and Germany, and till date remains committed to do so. I, in my personal capacity, attended the council meetings of 2013 and 2016, and our association was represented in 2019 General Assembly as well. Now I will talk about our work that we did in 39th and 40th General Assemblies, which are pending for implementation in the ICAO structure. I will be presenting 3 working papers as per below. Working paper 272, which is ICAO database of security recommendations of a global nature, which will become operational in the ICAO website. Sir, safety recommendations in relevant and singular cases must be communicated to ICAO, although they are not addressed directly to the organization, making them available to states so that they can review their civil aviation security systems accordingly. There have been different air accidents for similar causes. It could be probably avoided if the states which previously investigated the cause makes them available or public to others and show them how to resolve them. For example, the accident or shoot down of flight MH17 on July 17, 2014 over Ukraine with 298 people on board could have become a reason to avoid flying in conflict zones. The same tragedy happened again on January 8, 2020 with the downing of flight PS752, in which a total of 176 people perished. This working paper of ACVFFI requested to 39th Assembly in 2016 to urge the Council to create a database with recommendations that are global in nature and to consider an amendment to Annex 13 in which member states are required to notify the ICAO all recommendations that are global in nature. That completes my paper, WP 272. Coming to working paper 147, which is assistance of air accident victims in the airport emergency plans. Sir, recent air accidents at or near airports have shown a lack of effectiveness in assisting victims and at times even lack of respect for their religion or culture. When a plane crash occurs, the meeting place for the passengers' relatives is usually the airport. In most cases, airports do not have a well thought out and previously trained upon plan for assistance for victims and their families. This invariably leads to added problems of suffering for people who are already unfortunate enough to suffer the loss of their loved ones. We believe that it is highly necessary that a recommended practice be included in Annex 19 in this regard and also in the ICAO US SOP and EFODs. For example, in the last plane accident that occurred in my country, Pakistan, 2 were near Islamabad airport and 2 at Karachi airport. At both the locations and till date, there is no emergency plan in place or at least rehearsed upon. It was witnessed in all 4 air crashes that there was a complete confusion, lack of leadership, clear directives, or standard operating procedures adherence. The families were left to fend for themselves and rescue and recovery operations were left to untrained volunteers. This working paper of ACVFFI requested to 40th Assembly in 2019 request the Council to consider establishing a recommended practice in Annex 19, urge the states to accept the Victims Association as genuine stakeholders and to include them to collaborate, and to remind the states of Resolution A3927 of the Assembly. This concludes my working paper 147. Now I will address the working paper 149, which is the translations of the final safety investigation report of any accident to the language of all countries involved. Dear Sir, Madam Secretary General, in the last 20 years, civil aviation has had very complex and painful air accidents, flight disappearances, shoot downs in conflict zones, taking off, etc., and problems, and all factor common to all of them is the diversity of deceased passengers. The minimum right of their families is to know the truth about why they died. The final reports are usually published either in English or in French, but they are not translated into the different languages of the deceased passengers. In this way, relatives are denied the possibility of knowing why and in what way they died. It is a right enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, respect for the dignity of human beings, and to know the truth about the death of their relatives. For example, in the accident of Swift Air in Mali on July 24, 2014, was investigated by the French BEA. The final report was published in French, despite that there were 16 nationalities of the passengers, including 6 Spanish crew members who did not know the language. Previously, the accident of flight AF447 of July 1, 2009, with 33 nationalities, was only published in French and in English. This working paper of ACVFFI, requested again into 40th Assembly in 2019, urged the Council to amend the Chapter 7 of Annex 13 to recommend states to translate the final report of the safety investigation into the languages of all the passengers, and to request the states to translate the final report of investigation that is currently pending. As Secretary General of ACVFFI, I consider that the work carried out by ACVFFI through these international associations should be supported by the organization whose activity is focused on civil aviation. In addition, I should also deal with those who suffer air accidents caused by the negligence of people who must ensure the safety of air transport passengers. I rest my case, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Pilar, if I may give the floor again to Pilar, please.
Yes, Madam Pilar.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will continue, if I may.
Sure.
So thank you very much to Juniad. In 2016, at the 39th Assembly of ICAO, we presented Working Paper 271. It is essential for member states to have accident investigation authorities that ensure the independence of investigations. For this reason, the Council of ICAO should develop criteria for assessing the independence of accident investigation authorities. Also, USOAP audits should serve to identify compliance both with the requirement for having an investigation authority and for making sure that it's independent. One example of lack of updated models that lie behind Working Paper 271 is my own country. The person in charge of accident investigations, speaking before the Spanish Parliament in 2018, asserted that the judicial investigation and the safety investigation are not independent. And he appointed himself chief investigator without any kind of previous experience or training. Annex 13 safety investigations took precedence over the judicial investigation, which was closed without any responsibilities for 154 deaths and 18 serious injuries. The final report was published more than 3 years later after the accident, and of 43 recommendations in the report, only 12 were closed, 5 were cancelled, and 26 went unresolved. And in this situation, we wonder if ICAO is auditing compliance with Annex 13 as carefully as it might. States need to have a common framework for investigation authorities to meet their responsibilities in terms of safety. And that can only be achieved with an effective audit system. Working Paper 297 is on the policies on assistance to victims of air accidents and their families. This document seeks to upgrade recommended practice 8.46 into a standard. This is something we asked for at the 39th Assembly. So I'm not going to repeat what we said earlier. The situation remains the same. Recommendation 8.46 should be a standard, and we have been requesting this of the Assembly since 2016. It's been 5 years, more than 5 years, and we believe that to innovate, it's necessary to take this step and see that ICAO policy document 9998 is well known and properly implemented. There's no point proposing its revision when our experience is that policy document 9998 is almost totally unknown according to data on state uptake of the document. Working paper 500 in ICAO's statement on International Civil Aviation Day on December 6, 2020. The theme was innovation as a driver of global aviation development. Innovation, this is the key. ICAO was created in 1944. How many thousands of passengers have died in an accident? How many victims have been forgotten over time? Why has a day not been marked to remember them, as has been the case for entities and professionals and institutions who make up the structure of global aviation? Safety is essential to aviation, but when there are failures and people die, why can't we face the facts instead of forgetting? Does ICAO have statistics on the number of persons who have been killed in air crashes in the 76 years of its existence? I believe Council has the answers to those questions. Now, why should it be February 20th, this Day for Victims? The answer is simple. This is a month where there are no other international days. It's not a date that any of the accidents occurred, that we have suffered as a result of in the Federation, and it's not a date where there was any air disaster. It's only human to want to choose the date of any one of our accidents, but we have to be neutral. That gives us legitimacy to select a date that recognizes all of those who've perished in air accidents without highlighting any particular one. So the proposed date is to remember all victims of global aviation without any distinctions in their journey to eternity. The passengers did not know one another, but they died together. An International Day for the victims of air accidents will help to raise awareness by member states, international organizations, and those involved in air transport. It will enable ICAO to promote the standards and recommended practices in its policy for victims assistance in document 9998, recalling also that it's necessary to learn lessons from air disasters so as to ensure the safety of all users of global aviation. We've been working on many issues in ICAO since 2010. But this should be the easiest to achieve. You don't need any financial resources. There shouldn't be any controversy. And it would make up for years of forgetting. The memory of victims will contribute to, will help let people know that the terrible air accidents that have occurred require more than just one-off condolences. An air accident is often forgotten when the media stop covering it. But how can we reach out to the heart of people in the world and tell them that while some people forget, we can never forget? Material resources are not necessary to approve an International Day of Air Accident victims and their families. Only the will on your part, members of the Council, to approve it and do the necessary work to include it in the official calendar, as is the case for other international days. So it's up to the Council to make this happen. Document 434. More often than not, standards are not upheld and victims are left behind and they give up over time and don't claim their rights. Air safety means forcing insurers to uphold their policies with airlines and uphold international standards and pay the full damages to victims. This will make airlines safer. The terrible accidents that have occurred in the last 15 years have been especially cruel to victims, survivors, and families. But the aftermath was often cruel as well. Unequal, unfair treatment and sometimes offensive treatment by insurance companies and inefficient systems for handling victims' needs after the fact. For example, the representatives of the insurance company handling the crash of flight JK5022 spoke to the Spanish Parliament in 2018 and said that they had only allocated 3% of the policy amount of $1.5 billion for damages to the victims. And evidence came to light of a suspiciously close relationship between the insurance company and the civil aviation authorities. 12 years later, the insurance company is still pressing suits against the victims and survivors. The national compensation scale for road accidents was applied instead of the European ICAO standards to compensate victims and survivors. But this is not an exception in the world. In other countries, it's sometimes worse, hence the urgent need for the recommendations in Working Paper 434 to be carried out as requested by the Federation. Innovation might be the key word, and it has to also be applied to this sector, which has often been forgotten, unfortunately, to the detriment of the victims. Now, on lessons learned, what have we learned from these tragedies? The answer is, we had to do something more than weeping for our lost loved ones and seeing no changes and the same mistakes being made and the consequences suffered by the victims because of unplanned assistance, which was often ineffective and disrespectful to religious beliefs, cultural mores, and the lifestyles of each person. We have a right to know why our loved ones died, and for that it is essential for the investigation authorities to be independent, rigorous, professional, and accurate in detecting the errors and correcting them in civil aviation systems. That's the only way to ensure that similar accidents won't happen again. The imbalance is obvious between states, which, with some exceptions, do not always have an independent investigation authority. And for this reason, it is essential for the Council of ICAO to create minimum requirements to serve as a guide that can be followed. Assistance to victims and their families doesn't have a common framework, perhaps because not enough people know about ICAO Policy Document 9998. And this is why it is so important, after more than 8 years following its approval, and in view of the disappointing outcomes in its implementation, it's so important to redouble our efforts to disseminate the document and make sure it's implemented and followed up. Insurance companies often don't meet their obligations promptly and rigorously. They often play out the situation in lengthy court cases with unequal resources among the parties, which doubly harms the victims. Often the final reports are not translated into the language of the victims of the accidents, and their families have trouble finding out the cause of death. Airports often only provide assistance to families in the immediate aftermath, but they don't have set plans, and they don't have training and drills to prepare for emergencies. And often there are more deaths caused by late arrival of rescue services and medical services. The database of recommendations from accident investigation reports managed by whether or not the recommendations are addressed to ICAO is very important. We believe that this could prevent accidents. For example, the shoot down of MH17 in 2014 was similar to the accident involving KAL 007 in 1983. And tragically, on January 8th, 2020, the same thing happened again with flight PS 752, which was shot down by Iran. Recognizing the Safer Skies initiative of the Government of Canada, the Federation supported the declaration of December 8th, 2020. And this means that we believe that together, organizations, states, and victims can help prevent deaths of innocent people by making commercial aviation safer and preventing overflight of conflict zones. And we also note that the commitment of the Canadian government towards its citizens to help make this agreement global. We applaud this initiative, and we welcome the fact that the Canadian government quickly named January 8th a day to remember the flight PS 752. And we are sure that they fully understand our request to make International Day for Victims. But the Federation also needs decisive support from states. It's a very complicated and difficult situation for us to work for the common good. And I've only given you a few examples to explain why we have presented each of the 8 working papers that we presented to Assembly. They were discussed at the Assembly and it resulted in conclusions and resolutions, but sadly they haven't been implemented. And all of this is due to the inadequate assistance that we've received. We have to work in good faith with organizations, all of which have different interests, but we all share the same objective of improving aviation safety in every way and at all times, before, during, and after accidents, and in addressing failures in the system, which can cause suffering and death. We want to find meaning in the death of our loved ones, and this drives us to work to improve aviation safety and prevent there being more victims of air accidents in future. Now, proposals for the future. Today, we are asking the Council of ICAO to effectively implement the recommendations of the 8 working papers presented and discussed, and which yielded conclusions and recommendations of the Assemblies, the 39th and 40th Assemblies. Otherwise, the recommendations will go nowhere. We ask for states for support for the Federation and their associations. This would enable us to better cooperate and travel around to do our work. Our work is for the common good, and we require institutional recognition that currently does not exist. Monitoring and oversight of implementation of ICAO Policy Document 9998 and Recommendation 846 of Annex 9 in USOP audits, and the EFOD system is another thing we're asking for. We ask for support for the first ICAO symposium on assistance to victims of air accidents and their families, which we trust can be carried out in person on December 1st through the 3rd of this year in Gran Canaria Island, with the support of the Spanish government and the collaboration and support of the regional government of the Canary Islands. This is intended to be a forum to discuss aspects that are not yet covered and that have arisen from the major disasters in the last 10 years around the world. And it might be the start of a possible revision, which would include experiences from air tragedies. I invite all of you to attend this historical international event to make up for a lack of implementation of Document 9998 in member states. It would be worthwhile considering training in the Train Air Plus program, so as to raise awareness and a better understanding of assistance to victims. Include in ICAO's training courses for civil aviation directors, course on assistance to victims, and special training. The Federation and its associations could contribute with its experience and knowledge. Facilitate the participation of the Federation in ICAO TV programs, so as to sow the seed in member states and make sure that everybody understands that victims' assistance is essential and understand what it is and how it should be applied. Disseminate as much as possible policy document 9998 and promote its implementation by states using existing tools in ICAO, and consider its revision once the data are satisfactory. It's not appropriate to revise a document that's not very well known at this time, even though there have been more accidents in the last 5 years. The Federation will be asking for a special day-long side event at the upcoming high-level conference in October 2021 under safety and facilitation. Recognize that it is very important for ICAO to consider including on the agenda of the legal committee discussion on working paper 434, and alternatives should be suggested to address the clear inequalities experienced because of insurance companies. We trust that the stories of accident victims that we've told the Council today will stay in people's hearts, but also in their minds. It's in your hands to be able to innovate and alleviate the suffering of the next victims and families of air accidents. Mr. President, members of the Council, our Federation has done everything it can in and for ICAO. And now we ask you, what will ICAO do with the proposals of the Federation? Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Pilar. First of all, for the dignity that has characterized your presentation, and I wish to acknowledge this. You have mentioned the proposals submitted to the Assembly by the Federation. I will recall them. One issue on the flight over conflict zones, and since the last Assembly, unfortunately, there was another accident regarding flight over conflict zones that has triggered the Safe Sky initiative promoted by Canada, supported by almost all countries, members of this council. You mentioned the lack of a plan of assistance. That is something that is absolutely relevant for the implementation of a circular of document 9998. You mentioned the need to translate the report into languages of all passengers that lost their lives in the accident. You stressed the importance of independence of investigation entity, that is not all authorities. You stressed the request that was acknowledged by the Assembly to elevate the recommendation 8.46 of Annex 9 from recommendation to standard. You have recalled that there was a proposal to establish the day of dedicated to the air crash victims, and you have finally mentioned the working paper 438 related to the best practices for the compensation. Now I wish to give the floor to the Secretariat, inviting the Secretariat to skip the slides or to go fast on slides that are overlapping the presentations of President Pilar regarding background and regarding some historical references. And let's focus on the status of implementation of decisions that have been taken by the Assembly. Then we'll open the floor for discussion with the Council. So he's going to present probably Director ATB first. Correct. Director ATB, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'll try to be brief and not to do much of overlap between the two presentations. And a good day to everyone. And I wish to welcome the Chairperson and the Secretary General of the, and the team also of the Aircraft Victims Families Federations International. Let me start the presentation by highlighting that since the beginning of the aviation history, the air transport community has been facing the repeating challenges related to aircraft accidents with victims and the inherent drive to learn from the aircraft accident investigations in order to improve the levels of safety. As we all know, in the past decades until even the late 80s, there were almost 2,000 fatal victims of commercial aviation annually. And we all remember the year of 1985, mainly August month, which remains till now one of the deadliest single month in aviation history for aviation disasters. Fortunately, these numbers has been greatly reduced since the number of further improvement have been taking place, considering the needs of the families of victims as requested by the ICAO Assembly. In this presentation, we will briefly touch on, we will skip the historical background, but the recent developments of Annex 9 and the implementation status, the most recent Assembly resolutions adopted, and therefore moving to Annex 13 and associated guidance material, relevant task force and events, and also concluding with a proposed way forward. Next slide, please. I will not go much into this slide, but as resolution A32-7 stating that the state of occurrence should address the most critical needs of persons affected by civil aviation accidents. The policy of ICAO should be to ensure that the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of victims involved in the civil aviation accidents and their families are considered and accommodated by ICAO and its contracting states. And that states should provide homogeneous solutions for treatment of victims of accidents and their families. Next slide, please. So I will skip much of this, but I want to highlight that in 2005, Annex 9 introduced provisions to facilitate travel and entry of family members into the states of occurrence of the accidents. And on 12th of June 2015, the Council of ICAO adopted Amendment 25 of Annex 9, which is applicable since 2016, which included the recommended practices, mainly 8.46, for states to establish legislations and policies in support of assistance to the aircraft accident victims and their families. If we can move to the next slide quickly. And if you can click until the end, because we don't want to waste time. Chapter 8 has 4 standards and 2 recommended practices. Family members of victims may need to travel to the accident sites, a hospital or another location to meet the injured survivors, attend the memorial services, or visit the states of occurrence for reasons related directly to the accidents. Also, the operator personnel would need to travel without delay to the site of the accidents. Standard 8.41 and 8.42 address the obligations of the state's occurrence of an accident and the adjacent states with regard to the travel and entry of the family members and the aircraft operators. Now, Mr. President, if you allow me, I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Narjis Abdelnabi, Chief FAL, to continue with the presentation, starting with the effort data and the Annex 9 provisions. Over to you, Narjis.
Thank you, Mohammed, and good day to all. Next slide, please, Anthony. So on this slide, in fact, you see the data extracted from the Annex 9 compliance checklist in the EFOD system, and this is as of the 26th April 2021. You can see on this slide the level of compliance, the differences notified, and the number of states that have made no entries in the EFOD system, regarding notably to the related Annex 9 provisions as highlighted by the Director Air Transport Bureau. On average, we can see that for the compliance rate for the 4 related standards, is around 45%, while for the recommended practice 8.43, it is in fact the compliance rate is at 42%. Regarding the recommended practice 8.46, I would like to come back on the regional status of the level of implementation of this very important recommended practice, and I will come back to that in the coming slide. Next slide, please. So as it was mentioned before, and similarly to the 32nd Assembly, the 38th Assembly in 2013 recognized the need for the global implementation of family assistance. And this resolution was revised in 2016 to reflect recent work addressing family assistance. So A3927 superseded A38.1, by notably urging member states to establish legislation, regulation, and or policies to support victims of civil aviation accidents and their family members in consideration of the ICAO policy in Doc 998 and of Annex 9, and pursuant also to Article 28 of the Montreal Convention of 28 May 1999. So in fact, this resolution also urges member states to inform ICAO through the compliance checklist in the IFOD system of the level of implementation of the provisions in Annex 9 associated with family assistance plans. Next slide, please. Then in 2019, while A3927 is still in force, A4016 urges member states to implement the provisions of Annex 9 to facilitate assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families, and also requested the Council to consider upgrading Annex 9 RP 8.46 into an international standards, while the resolution is also requesting the Council to consider introducing the new Annex 9 recommended practice addressing to aircraft and airport operators on the development of appropriate plans. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, this slide is showing, in fact, the regional implementation of RP 8.46, including, of course, the level of compliance, the differences files, and the no entries made from a regional perspective. The global rate of this recommended practice is at 28%, which is a little bit higher than the one compiled in 2018, which was at 25%. The regional level of compliance is quite different from one region to another, being at 67% in the Middle East, at 38% in the ERNAT and SAM regions, around 25% in the NACC and WACAF regions, and around 10% in the APAC and ISAF regions. So, most importantly, in fact, it is to be noted that 131 states have not made entries in the IFOD system regarding this specific recommended practice. So therefore, we can assume that maybe the compliance rate may be higher than what we are seeing in this slide. So while the Secretariat continues to collaborate with member states at the regional level on implementation of Annex 9 provisions, including, of course, the RP 8.46, there is a need to supplement this data in order to discuss in an informative way during the FAL 12 meeting, which is planned in July 2021. Next slide, please. So in that context and pursuant to the Assembly Resolution A4016, a state letter will be issued, in fact, this week, urging member states to implement the dedicated recommendations of A4016 and there was the states will be asked to complete an online survey which contains Annex 9 provisions on assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families. And this will, of course, enable us to collect more data in order to discuss these different items at the next facilitation panel meeting. I will now wish to give the floor to the Director of the Air Navigation Bureau to present the work related to Annex 13 and associated audit results. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Narges. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you today. In Annex 13, the standards and recommended practices regarding accident investigations include a section titled States Having Suffered Fatalities or Serious Injuries to Their Citizens. And in that section, we call out the rights and entitlements of those states. The rights for a state which has a special interest in an accident by virtue of fatalities or serious injuries to its citizens shall be entitled to appoint an expert who shall be entitled to visit the scene of the accident. And I won't read the other bullets. The most important element of this, though, is the statement that this will not preclude the state from also assisting in the identification of victims and in meetings with survivors from that state. So this is not a constraining set of rights and entitlements. And then, of course, there's a note that the guidance and manual on accident assistance to accident victims and their families, Doc 9973, should be referred to. And the next slide, please. The audit and oversight. Next slide, please. The audit and oversight monitoring of these provisions are covered in two specific protocol questions that asks states if they has the investigation authority established and implemented procedures to ensure that relevant and timely information on the progress of the investigation will be provided to the families and accident survivors. And then a second protocol question, has the state established a comprehensive system for providing assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families? These two protocol questions are usually addressed in the response to the audit questionnaire and then validated on site in USOAP CMA audits. But since we've been in the pandemic, we have been working to establish a virtual audit capacity, which will be assessed in this quarter in its first use. And as Madam Vila said earlier, the best practices of managing these accident investigations is essentially promulgated as part of guidance that key authorities around the world work together on to bring the information forward in a way that's more fully understandable to the accident victims' families. Thank you. I'll hand the presentation back.
Thank you, Director ATB. Is there any?
Thank you, Steve, and I will continue the presentation. Very quickly, the first guidance on family assistance was issued in 2001 through the Circular 285, which with the objective to provide guidance on the types of family assistance. And the aim of this circular was also to better prepare all the parties involved and to facilitate the coordination between them, and of course to describe the scope of their involvement. Next slide, please. Then in May 2013, we have the two manuals that were issued, the ICAO policy on assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families, the Doc 9998, and then it was followed by the issuance of the manual on assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families, the Doc 9973, in December 2013. So the ICAO policy provides, in fact, a strategic approach of family assistance matters, addressing notably states' legislation, regulation, policies, and the structure of the family assistance plan, while the DOC 9973 contains guidance to assist states in implementing those policies. Next slide, please. It is also of importance to mention the special session that was held on 16 October 2018 alongside the 13th Air Navigation Conference, and it was touching upon legislation, regulation, and policies on family assistance, touching also on ICAO provisions stemming from both A39, the compliance checklist in the IFOD, and the results of the USOP audits. It was also the opportunity to share lessons and experience on the provision of family assistance, notably from China, France, Malaysia, Netherlands, and the Federation, ACVFFI Federation. And finally, it was closed by a roundtable to provide prospective views on family assistance and the way forward. Next slide, please. So the proposed way forward in relation to the work of ICAO. Regarding to the provisions of Annex 9, the items that were highlighted by Mrs. Pilar will be discussed under the agenda item 2 of the facilitation panel 12 as approved by the ATC. So we will review the level of implementation of the provisions in Annex 9 associated with family assistance plan. And this will be based, of course, on the inputs from IFOD, and this we will ask our regional officers to request the states to enter more entries in the IFOD system, but also to rely on the answers that we are going to receive to the survey of the state letter, which will be issued, in fact, today. This will be, of course, the opportunity to discuss the upgrade of RP 8.46 to an Annex 9 standard, and also the opportunity to consider introducing a new Annex 9 recommended practice addressed to aircraft and airport operators on the development of appropriate plans. And as it was mentioned by Mrs. Pilar regarding the proposed establishment of an annual commemoration day dedicated to victims of air accident, it will be also discussed under this agenda item of the facilitation panel. As it was also mentioned, we are preparing to have a symposium on assistance to victims of air accidents and their families, which is kindly hosted by Spain. The dates have been postponed to 1 to 3 December 2021 in order to hopefully have this symposium held in person. And this symposium is expected to cover facilitation, safety, and legal aspects. Regarding the provision of appropriate training to states on the DOC 9998 and 9973, it is considered to have the development of a Trainer Plus course, and of course to explore how additional resources could be assigned to the management of the various aspects related to this important issue of assistance to victims of air accidents and their families. We have discussed with Mrs. Pilar from the ACVFFI the submission of working paper to the FALP 12 and also to the high-level conference on COVID, which is planned in October, which could be perhaps considered under the agenda item 5, which is covering other business in the facilitation stream. My last slide is the one that has been coordinated with the colleagues from the GATT in order to be able to develop a Trainer Plus course, which could be a course on 4 or 5 days, either virtual or face-to-face course, and under a timelines development, a very short timelines development, which could be under 6 months if we have enough resources devoted to that. And this course should be hopefully available to be presented at the symposium planned in December. Thank you, Mr. President. That's all for the presentation from the Secretariat.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Secretariat for the presentations. I believe that these presentations provide some answers to part of the requests of the Federation of Association Victims. Now I open the floor for discussion. I'm the impression that maybe that the functionality to raise the hand is not always working, and just in case, please turn on your video so that I can recognize that you wish to speak. Let's start with the representative of Mexico, Mr. Dionisio Mendez. Representative of Mexico, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good day, colleagues. And thank you very much to Ms. Vera and Mr. Hamid for their presentation. This issue is coming back to us and has been under discussion for years in the organization. And although there has been some progress, as Secretariat showed us, the organization is striving to raise awareness in its actions and help boost compliance with the provisions for victims assistance. But this is a matter that has not been progressing as all of us would like. And the wishes of the Federation are wholly legitimate. Of course, we know that from a technical point of view, the organization has been carrying out some actions to try to find a comprehensive solution to this problem, but there isn't enough harmonization around the world. It's not minimally acceptable at this stage. But that's not to say that the organization is not doing its job. It has been doing its bit, but usually this item isn't always at the top of the agenda of the organization, and that's something we have to address, Mr. President. And of course, the other matter is finding and increasing the political will in states. Many of these actions fall to civil aviation authorities, and there's not enough visibility vis-a-vis states for them to be able to take the necessary steps to comply with the minimum requirements of ICAO, especially in finding more comprehensive solutions that give a dignified response to victims and their families. So my suggestion would be the following. I know that it's not necessarily relevant here and now because of the suspension of flights, but once things get back to normal, I think this issue should be mainstreamed. It should be mentioned in all official visits of the top officials of ICAO to states, and make sure that ministers and the highest authorities are aware of this problem, and make sure they try to find solutions on the basis of ICAO's proposals and its actions, not just standards, but recommended practices for victims' assistance. I think the presentation by Vera shows that we're still far away from that goal, but steps have been taken in the organization, and it's important to follow up. As Vera said, it's important to follow up and monitor and make sure that at least the very minimum provisions are being upheld in the contracting states. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mexico, yes, suggestion is very good. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the implementation of ICAO documents on this matter are not normally managed only by civil aviation authorities. And this is one of the reasons why in some states there are more difficulties, but it's absolutely appropriate to raise this issue in occasion of meetings at the political level, at the highest level of political level. I see many hands that are being raised, but I will give the floor first to Representative of Canada. My understanding is he has not raised a hand, but he wants to speak. And there is a reason why I want to give him the floor first. Representative of Canada, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I do wish to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation International and thank them for sharing their important views with us today. Canada strongly recognizes the important role played by family associations that support victims' loved ones as they process profound loss and experience unspeakable grief. We especially commend the important advocacy work of the ACVFFI has undertaken in defense of victim rights, including their efforts at ICAO. Canada understands these efforts all too well and can relate to the plight of families of victim associations. Sadly, we have firsthand experience of air tragedies, most recently through the downing of Ukraine International Airlines flight PS752, where many who perished had ties to Canada. In honor of those lost, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau designated January 8th as Canada's National Day of Remembrance for victims of air disasters. This annual occurrence, which took place for the first time in 2021, acknowledges the deep loss of those who have perished in all air tragedies, both at home and abroad, and expresses Canada's enduring compassion to the victims' loved ones. The importance of designating a date of remembrance for the victims of air tragedies cannot be overstated. As such, Canada supports ACVFFI's efforts for an International Day of Air Crash Victims and their families to be established. The date of January 8th could be considered in this regard. At the same time, Canada is also committed to ensuring that risks to civil air operations arising from conflict zones are properly mitigated so as to prevent future air tragedies. The Canadian-led Global Safer Skies Initiative, which aims to improve the safety of air travel worldwide by addressing gaps in the way the civil aviation sector deals with conflict zones, arose from our firm belief that the international community needs to do more, that it needs to work together to ensure these tragedies do not happen again. I thank the ACVFFI for supporting this initiative, including their endorsement of the Safer Skies Commitment Statement, which calls on signatories to renew their commitment to a global approach to mitigating risks arising from conflict zones. Canada notes the recent addition of the Association of Families of Flight PS752 Victims, as well as the Dutch MH17 Flight Disaster Foundation, as members of ACVFFI, and is grateful for the additional support these families will receive as a result of this membership. Canada would also like to recognize Spain's leadership in working to provide proper support to aircraft accident victims and their families, and offer our support for the continuation of these efforts. In closing, Mr. President, I wish to express Canada's continued support for the related work being undertaken at ICAO and thank the Secretariat for their presentation today. I also want to stress the importance of continued open communication with associations of air crash victims and their families. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor, and thank you once again to ACVFFI for being here today and presenting on this important issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the government of Canada for the commitment and the engagement on the Safer Sky Initiative. This is very important indeed. Now, while I will ask the representative of ACI to stay on standby, I will give first the floor to some council representatives, starting with Representative of France, Ambassador Laurent Pic.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Like those before me, I would like to commend the President and Secretary General and the ACVFFI on this initiative. Like you, I would like to say how dignified this story was, and we understand the terrible pain of the victims' families. As the Federation's representatives said, they have used their pain to help us improve things, and that is very remarkable. It's in everybody's interests. I've heard all of the messages and see all the work that the associations have been doing. And of course, there's the issue of implementation by states of existing SARPs. This is something that has to be monitored. And as I understand Secretariat's presentation, there will be stepped up monitoring, but it's our collective duty to examine each of the requests put forward by the associations and understand what lessons are to be learned for our organization and how we can make improvements in addressing their legitimate requests. This is something that we should do together in the Council. It's very important to me, and we and my colleagues and I will make sure this happens. One of the actions requested is symbolic designation of an international day for all air crash victims. I think we should look at this very quickly. As Ms. Pilar Vera said, it doesn't require any major resources, and I think we should get on this very quickly. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Representative of France. And indeed, we have seen that the topic of the establishment of a day dedicated to air crash victims is in the fall panel in July. Anyway, I wish to bring this issue in consideration to the Council during the current session. Now I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom, Andrew Orney.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful to both Madame Pilar Vera and Mr. Juniad Hamid of Air Crash Victims Families Federation International for taking the time to speak to Council today. And I recognise other members of the Federation also attending. I'm also grateful to Ms. Pilar for writing to me last week. Thanks to the Secretariat for their updates. The issues that the Families Federation raise are of the utmost importance. These issues are also of direct relevance to our work as a council supporting international civilian aviation. It's for very good reason that both security and safety are two of our top priorities here. The UK takes all air accidents very seriously. We have deep sympathy for each and every loss of life as a result of these disasters, and I'd like to express my personal support to the Families Federation. It's right that we at ICAO do what we can to support families better at such incredibly difficult times, and to consider areas where we can improve our work further. I'm grateful to you, Mr. President, and for your and the Secretariat's focus on these important issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative of the United Kingdom. And now I give the floor to Representative of Costa Rica, Guillermo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very good day to everyone. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of the representatives of the Federation and the various associations that make it up. And I give my special thanks to Vera and Hamid for their very timely, heartfelt presentations. And I'm also grateful to have this opportunity and for having this presentation and exchange of proposals. we in the Council need to take action. That is fundamental. I'd also like to express appreciation to the representative of Spain and the state of Spain for their initiatives over the years. When I was in the DGCA in Costa Rica, I had the opportunity to work very closely with the Accident and Incident Investigations Unit, and I tried to do some things to make it stronger and provide it with more resources. So I know a thing or two about all the challenges before states in this field, especially resources. And it's a problem not just in Costa Rica, but in Central America. And a lot of actions have been taken to address that, to improve accident and incident investigation, and also to provide assistance to victims. And this is fundamental. And I think everyone in the Council supports this. So we want to make sure that airport and aircraft operators have a proper plan. We've seen major shortcomings. And it's important to talk to victims and their families. The families of people who have perished. And it's very emotional. It's hard to do. And I want to give my personal recognition to Vera and congratulate her and everybody else for their tenacity, their perseverance, and for being able to channel their pain and their frustration into actions that can improve things and to try to get answers in such a difficult situation. Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Representative of Costa Rica. And now I give the floor to Representative of Brazil, Ambassador Moretti.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, good morning to you. Good evening, good afternoon, good evening to all. Mr. President, today exceptionally, I'll speak in Spanish as a homage to Ms. Vera and to all the Brazilians, families of victims of air crashes, given the fact that Spanish is the language that is closer, the official UN language that is closer to Portuguese, my mother tongue. Yo quisiera entonces, señor Presidente.
So, Mr. President, I would like to give a very warm welcome to Vera and all of the representatives of ACVFFI. And I'd also like to give a special warm welcome to the president of the Brazilian Association of Air Crash Victims, Zasali, who's attending. The Brazilian Association has been an important partner with the Brazilian government when it comes to providing assistance to victims and their families following air accidents. They're very active internationally, and I want to publicly commend her on her work. Mr. President, there's so much to say, but I don't want to take up too much time. Let me just say for a start that Brazil, 20 years ago, introduced regulations to help victims and their families. And I'm proud to say that 20 years later, this type of legislation has helped us make improvements, improve compliance. And one of our practices that we adopted was audits, tabletop audits, tabletop exercises, in which we try to determine what plans aircraft and airport operators have to address this kind of problem. And we have also been active internationally. And we've been working together with the Brazilian Association. We've been working very closely to prepare ICAO documents 998 to 9973. And we're proud to have been able to work very closely with the Brazilian Association for Victims. And to conclude, a lot has yet to be done. We've done some things at national and international level, but there's certainly a lot more to be done. And now is the time to do it, both at national and international levels. And many of the requests of the Federation are more than legitimate and totally viable. And Council needs to give its full attention to these requests. And I'm sure that we'll be able to be more effective. I'd like to conclude with 2 points that the Federation made. One is memory, and the other is insurance. It seems to me that it's very important for all of those who've suffered loss, for their loved ones not to be forgotten. The victims and families must not be forgotten. And designation of an international day is essential for this. In Rio, I once visited a beautiful memorial in a park to victims of Air France 447 crash, and I personally understood how important it is to have some kind of public manifestation, collective manifestation of sympathy for the loss of loved ones. And this brings me to the issue of insurance. Today, victims of air crash between Bolivia and Colombia, Flight 2933, it was carrying a football team from southern Brazil, and the plane crashed. And even today, the families are still having serious problems with the insurance company, which is not meeting its obligations. The Brazilian government and the ministry has been trying to provide support to the families, but the results have not been satisfactory. And this is a major issue. And Council needs and governments need to do everything possible and take and be proactive and take firm action. Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Brazil. This is a very important issue. And now I give the floor to Representative Malaysia. We perfectly remember Malaysia suffered 2 major accidents in 2014. Representative Malaysia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Morning, Mr. President, Madam Secretary General, and everyone. Malaysia would like to thank the Chairwoman of the Air Crash Victims Families Federation, Ms. Pilar Vera, and also the Secretary General, Mr. Juniad Hamid, on the very informative presentation to the Council on the background and work of the organization, especially on the working papers to the 39th and 40th ICAO Assemblies. Malaysia also would like to thank the Secretariat of ICAO on the proposed way forward for this agenda. Malaysia acknowledges the effort and good work of both the organization and ICAO in assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families. We share the sentiment with the disappearance of flight MH370 in 8 March 2014, with all 227 passengers and 12 crew aboard presumed dead, and also on the downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, a civilian aircraft on an international flight which occurred on 17 July 2014 over eastern Ukraine with the loss of all 298 passengers and crew on board. Malaysia would like to reiterate the importance of enhancing standards and strengthening international cooperation to improve safety in global civil aviation. Malaysia supports the proposal of the Federation, especially in the designation of a day as the International Day of Air Crash Victims and their families to create awareness of aircraft crash. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative of Malaysia. I give the floor to Representative of the Netherlands. At the same time, I don't see any longer the hand raised by Representative of ACI World. Please be prepared after the representative of the Netherlands. Please, Representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and good morning to you. First of all, I would like to thank Madam Vera Palmes and Mr. Hamid for their presentations today. Secondly, I would like to say that perhaps it is not surprising that an organization like ICAO tends to focus mostly on the safety-related aspects, also with regard to any air crashes that occur. And of course, any crash is one too many, especially when it involves the loss of lives, and it often entails human suffering, especially human suffering that occurs on a scale like we experienced in the Netherlands in July 2014 with the downing of the MH17, where so many Dutch families lost loved ones and the entire country was plunged into mourning. So from that perspective, I think it is equally important that an organization like ICAO is actively engaged in whatever it can do to support the families of victims of air crashes. And of course, not just ICAO, but states themselves as well. So I have taken careful notes today of the lessons learned you presented and the proposals you have presented to the Council. And I can assure you that my government and I myself personally will be actively engaged in any follow-up to this meeting, because I believe the Council has a responsibility to consider which of your proposals we can take forward. And I think there are quite a few that we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative of the Netherlands. Before giving the floor to the representative of Spain, I wish to check if a representative of the ACI World is still no. Oh,
yes.
Yeah. Please go ahead. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are very grateful for this presentation of the Federation's priorities on a very important issue. First of all, I am sorry to hear of the suffering caused by the lack of coordination experienced during these tragic events. At a time of great loss, no one should have to see their distress further compounded by confusion or misunderstanding. So on behalf of ACI representing the world's airports, I just wanted to comment on the specific recommendation that is addressed to operators, including airport operators. The Assembly responded to Working Paper 147 by asking the Council to consider a new recommended practice in Annex 9 addressed to operators on the development of appropriate plans to provide assistance to aircraft accident victims and their families. My comment today is not on the need for airports to develop and enforce provisions on this subject. This is absolutely the right thing to do. But my comment is on where in the ICAO framework this should be placed to ensure an efficient and coordinated response to emergencies. The Secretariat today noted that there are several provisions contained in Annex 9, but these relate to arrangements to facilitate the entry of families. So the focus is really on border control. The development of a standalone family assistance plan at airports could cross over Annex 14, which already requires airports to develop and maintain aerodrome emergency plans. A separate document may create confusion and additional burdens that might impact an orderly and well-coordinated and well-rehearsed response to emergencies. In other words, Mr. President, we are very grateful for the recommendation to look at provisions for victims to have to have a plan in place. But we believe this could be coordinated with the existing standard on aerodrome emergency plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative ACI. Now I wish to give the floor to Representative of Spain, Victor Aguado, who has been mentioned also by President of ACVFFI for his active role also in coordinating and promoting the symposium that will be held in December 2021. Representative of Spain, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to express my thanks to the Federation, Pilar Vera and Juniad Hamid for an excellent presentation and very constructive proposals, some of which we'd heard before and which are still pending, but the proposals were constructive. And I'd also like to share with you 8 thoughts. First, I'd like to thank you for creating this opportunity and reaching out to the Federation. It's the first meeting between the Council of ICAO and Federation of this type in history. So it's a historic event that we're living right now, and we shouldn't forget it. In the 76 years of ICAO's history, this is the first time. Second, in aviation, my colleagues have mentioned and I'm grateful for their excellent contributions. But in aviation, we have runways and control towers, but we often forget the human dimension, and that's what we're looking at today. And council members are responding to the need to enhance this dimension. I'm grateful for that. And third, in aviation, we know about risk management. We know that there's no such thing as zero risk. And so we know that there can be more accidents, and this is why we have to take up this matter. Fourth, some exemplary work has been done by those who kicked off this process, Mr. Ephraimson, Ms. Palmez, and Mr. Pitanaroli. And this was mentioned, it was all started at the Assembly in 2013, and we have to keep it going. Fifth, we are aviation professionals, and this is a professional matter, but it's also an intellectual exercise. But there's an emotional side to this as well. And this gives the Federation a legitimacy that not everybody has. And so I think we need to give special thought to this aspect. 6, we are aware that in any tragedy, those who suffer have to go through a difficult cycle of transition, of grief. They have to go from pain to action, from rage and indignation. They have to move to contribution to the common good. And it's a very hard transition to make. And so I'm very grateful indeed to the Federation for showing that this transition is part of their DNA as a federation. And that transition is essential for any kind of association that wants to contribute to the common good. My 7th thought is that we have instruments in hand, recommendation 8.46, a policy document, which is a council document. It's an ICAO policy. It's not a manual. It's a policy from council, and we also have the manual. And these 3 documents are monitored in audits, USOP, and in EFOD, but we realize that the compliance rate is only 28% in states, and that's not enough, so we have to do something more. And finally, Mr. President, as we heard, the Spanish government is committed to the cause of the victims. We had a very traumatic experience with a Spanair accident in Madrid, and for that reason, we are committed to cooperating closely with ICAO in hosting this symposium, which is expected to take place on December 1st to the 3rd, and I invite all of you to attend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Of Spain. Now, before drawing some conclusions of this important meeting, I wish to ask the President of ACVFFI, Madame Pilar, if you wish to react, to add something. Madame Pilar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank you and all of the state representatives for your input and for your messages that you've been putting in the chat. I thank you for your support. For the first time, a representative is speaking in this context to the Council, and the Council is listening to us and they understand us. And there's one main idea I want to share. The legitimacy that we have as a federation derives from the decision which I took in my case, a personal decision following the crash in Madrid. There were two ways ahead. One was to try to change my pain into something positive, to prevent other people from suffering the same things that we suffered, or carry a weight of suffering and vengeance throughout life, which was caused by having to live without our loved ones. And we strive to be neutral. Each of us carries the loss of our loved ones in our hearts. We want to know how the accidents happened. And we'd be less credible if we fixated on the date of the accident in which our loved ones died. We want a neutral date because we don't want to place any accident above any other and give precedence. So if we want to be credible, we have to be neutral. We aren't working for one accident victim as opposed to another. Only neutrality will bring us to the point we want to be with states in working in the interests of victims and their families. And I am sure that we will at all times be able to uphold the standards of courtesy and continue our work, because we have to go down this path together, each in their own way, but together. And I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to Mr. Shakitano and to all of the members of the Council who spoke and voiced their support, and for listening to our message and recognizing the work that we've been doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Pilar. Indeed, the dignity with which you have been participating in this meeting and the neutrality is a key element that can just help and enhance the communication awareness of the Council on this subject. The Council is a governing body of the organization. It's working at the policy level and is monitoring the implementation of decisions. And it's important that our discussion will be held, as was today, at a high level. at the policy level. With this, I believe that this meeting has been very much helpful for the Council, because the level of understanding and the level of awareness for sure has been increased. At the same time, we have identified a certain number of issues that have been addressed in the Assembly, last Assembly, previous Assemblies, still lack of implementation or delays implementations. More recently, we perfectly know COVID-19. We had also an exchange in our messages that there were some delays in addressing these matters in connection with the COVID-19. We have seen that the Secretary has already planned to discuss most of the items in the FAL panel in July. I reiterate my intention to bring to the Council during the current session, so before July, the reflections on this meeting, and possibly the decision already taken during this session on establishing a day dedicated to the crash victims. And again, the date that you have proposed, that is 20 February, and we have been discussing internally why it was 20 February. I must acknowledge is a great decision of neutrality, because the dedication of a date to crash victims should be in order to remember them, but at the same time to push and to put more energy on the work that we are doing, thanks also to the contribution of this federation, in order to enhance the ability of the member states to, first of all, to prevent the accident that would happen, because this is our priority with safety. At the same time, once that these accidents would happen, member states would be prepared properly, according to the practices, policies, and recommendations that have been developed by ICAO. With this, I conclude this meeting. I thanking very much the Federation of Association of Victims, thanking very much the representatives that have not spoken but have been with us today. And I want to assure you again that this matter will remain in our agenda at the highest position possible. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.